So thanks for having me here. The motivation for this work is quite straightforward, actually, right? So over the last 2 decades, there's been this drastic rise in temporary migration, primarily for work, making it now the most dominant form of migration, especially from developing to developed countries. And so much that temporary migrant workers constitute today around 5% of the total global workforce. And even looking within our own region, like there are more than 25 million workers from South Asia currently employed as temporary migrant workers in other rich Asian countries, including Malaysia, right? And this is perhaps, yes.
Sorry, just a quick clarification. Like, can you define quickly what temporary migration means? Like, the duration of migration?
So there's not a precise definition of what a temporary migration workers mean, but typically in our context, these are workers that do not have significant opportunity for long-term assimilation in the destination countries they go to. Their visas are often tied to the fixed period of time, which is also the case in migrants to the US as well. Like H-1Bs are often tied and a fixed limit, but over time we sort of understand that there is long-term assimilation for at least some of those migrants in US, unlike in Malaysia and GCC, where there is more sort of explicit understanding of no long-term assimilation there. So that's how I guess we should understand when we use the term here. Yeah. Any other questions? All right.
So Daniel, you in Malaysia, you're a temporary migrant.
Yeah, and it has nothing to do by.
Will they count or not? Huh? Will they count in your sample or
not? In our sample, if you had to take a permit to go abroad, so from Nepal, most workers have to get a work permit to travel abroad to work. As you know, I mean, both of us are also migrants from Nepal, but we never got the permit. So implicitly, the government tends to target certain type of work. So high-end migration, although might be temporary, are exempted from the permit. So in our sample here, these are workers who went abroad with a permit from the government of Nepal. Yeah, so I mean, the reason is perhaps not that surprising. Migration leads to immediate income gains for migrants and their families back home. But perhaps what is less understood, while no less important, is the question, does this limited time spent abroad by migrants benefit them and their communities after they return, right? And previously, knowledge acquired by returned migrants have been credited with new job creation and economic recovery, as well as changes in their political preferences have led to greater demand for better governance and accountability in the origin country. Right? On the other hand, Gibson and co-authors have this novel lab experiment where they show that the individual's migration experience does not necessarily change their preferences in the long term, right? In terms of their appetite for risk or their views about the market economy and this economic decision making. But nevertheless, what all these papers are sort of trying to say is that the migration effect extends beyond mere financial gains. And as migrants' experience can shape their preferences and influence their decisions long after they return. So in this paper, we investigate, does temporary migration affect social identity that determines how returnees interact with individuals that belong to a different social group than them, and whether their migration experience can be leveraged to overcome pre-existing social divisions that are prevalent in the origin country. Right? And these potential sort of effects that we are trying to study here can easily be described and explained in theory through the model of social identity, where individuals not only care about themselves, but they also care about other people, but they care about in-group members more. Right? And in the lab environment, at least, this social identity has been shown previously to affect individuals' contribution to the public goods. Right? For example, when groups are made salient, subjects tend to contribute more to public goods created within in-group members. Right? And moreover, in similar lab settings, identity and salience itself could be manipulated. For example, like if you shift away from separating identities to a more unifying common identity, subjects tend to contribute more to the public goods as well. Right?
Sorry, what do you mean by salient?
So salient could be, there are different ways to bring out salience. So in the lab, right, for example, you could ask, like if you want to make ethnicity salient in this example, you could just simply ask, give me your full name. And if I have to explicitly reveal to the group my last name is X and that is tied to an identity, that's making a ethnic identity more salient. You could do that by showing pictures or talking about certain topics and genders. So in the US, there's a lab experiment that is sort of very famous about where you show pictures of female rights and females working in different environments to sort of make your female identity more salient. And therefore, any experiment sort of that follows that salience treatment makes the subject act more female, quote unquote, right? So I do understand the motivation of the question. Salience is sort of a black box.
Right.
And it's not clear what exactly are you doing in terms of interventions.
Right.
But in the experiment world and psychology world, taking their example of what specific interventions they had used, there are a set of standard salience interventions in the lab setting at least, right, where you can control the environment.
No, but what I was thinking about more is like, you think of the social identity. It's a vector with a bunch of things.
Yeah.
And you want to find out what is the source of the bias, what is the element of that vector that contributes to the bias as much as possible, or the most.
So I think your question has 2 points there. One, even if, let's say, I can pinpoint an identity, right, and crank it up,
right,
how do I understand the mechanism from there to observing in the lab outcomes change, right? What is that? Which is still a black box, because there's not a model that we have that we can use that helps us understand the intervening mechanism from what identity does to certain outcomes. The second point I think you're trying to make, which we have sort of tried to address, is there are multiple dimensions of identity as well, right? You could simultaneously be a ethnicity A, gender B, social status C, region X. Then the question is, when I have a salience treatment, what exact identity are you playing with, and can you sort of make it exclusive? And in some cases that can be, and especially in the lab setting, you can at least design it with that in mind. But identities itself are interacting, right? When you trigger one, how does that interact with a different identity? Right. I'll try to come in terms of when I describe the experiment a little more on that, but it's a very valid point. So these, lab settings are also in line and perhaps underlay a more well-established literature in economics, which finds this negative relationship between ethnic diversity and, worse the economic outcomes that are found in many countries, right? Yes, you had a question?
No.
Oh, sorry. But moreover, a real world evidence that comes closest to these lab findings comes from this interesting paper where they show that the Hajj experience of religious migrants leads to more pro-social behavior among returnees, pilgrim returnees in Pakistan, even towards members that are non-Muslims. In contrast, what we are trying to examine is, does temporary migration for work also leads to increase in pro-social behavior among returnees in Nepal? So this question is particularly interesting in the context of Nepal, for those of you who don't know exactly, is that Nepal recently came out of a prolonged period of civil war that was in part fueled by ethnic tensions and disparities. And in that context, there's a recent paper that shows an increase in pro-sociality among violence-affected communities in Nepal. And this is not surprising in the literature. In fact, it's common in many other post-conflict settings where you see an increase in pro-sociality. But a growing number of these body of research in those settings suggests that the increase in social cohesion comes from increased in-group bias, where you increase pro-sociality towards individuals who belong to the same ethnic group as your own, often at the expense of the other. Right? And in fact, in the voting data from the first post-conflict election held in Nepal, shows a strong co-ethnic bias in how people vote. In particular, the results show that there is a strong correlation between the share of Brahmin Kshetri ethnic eligible voters, which is the largest ethnic group in Nepal, and the total votes received by all Brahmin Kshetri candidates in a municipal election, right? Suggesting that people tend to vote for candidates who belong to the same ethnic group as them.
Sorry, quick question on that graph. Why are there so many zeros and ones?
It's because if there are certain municipalities that don't have eligible Brahmin Kshetris, sometimes it's zero. The second one is if Brahmin Kshetri candidates did not get any votes, or they were not part of the voter candidate list, that's why it is low. There are certain ones where Brahmin Kshetris were the only candidates.
So that's more likely to happen on the right, at least, right? Like
So even if you sort of remove the two X, you still get a positive relationship here.
So how do you define pro-sociality here? Because like if I'm just looking at votes, like this is not necessarily
we have a very specific definition of pro-sociality here, like three specifically. Again, I mean, this result on co-ethnic bias in voting is not surprising and not different from other voting patterns observed in other ethnically diverse countries as well, especially when ethnicity is often the most rigid and the most salient identity, and when conflicts tend to have ethnic component in it, the aftermath of the conflict is often quite difficult, where people are unwilling to cooperate with the other side. In both conflict and non-conflict settings, however, there are interventions that seeks to improve social cohesion within a diverse group. And most of these interventions are sort of related to the CDD program that relies on strengthening communities to not just design, but deliver interventions, which is the biggest poor interventions that most of the development organizations sort of try to implement the modality through. And the evaluations of those interventions, either singular intervention or a group of intervention as part of a CDD, the results show that it's kind of mixed of how successful direct interventions to improve social cohesion can be. And again, I mean, social norms are actually quite difficult to change. And there are studies that show, social identities and social norms associated with those identities tend to get passed from generations to generation. Okay. Our results are also related to a much larger literature on international migration. And, since migration has been viewed as one of the most effective development policy, there's a wide range of interventions that seeks to improve the impact of migration. Most of them, however, focus on either improving prospective earnings of current or future migrants, or better utilizing their remittances, right, for more productive use. However, the interventions on assimilation of returned migrants is almost non-existent. Little that we know about returnees come from evidence from returning refugees or returning students, whose migrant experience vastly differs from the limited assimilation temporary migrant workers tend to have in the foreign country of employment, right? And also raising concerns whether these restricted experiences are actually beneficial to the migrant in the long term. I'm going to skip that. Okay, let me just give you the summary of the result in one word. Yes, pro-sociality does go up, but the interesting question is, how do we address why this is happening and what kind of pro-sociality are we observing and what it means to the real world, right? So Nepal is a very ethnically diverse country. There are 128 unique ethnicities and almost the equal number of languages spoken among them. For this study, we categorize them into 6 broad ethnic groups. Brahmin Kshetris that make up 31% of the population. They are the largest ethnic group, closely followed by Janjatis that are indigenous groups that make up 23%. The rest are Madeshis, Dalit, Newars, and minorities. In this study, we focus on Brahmin Khetris and Janjatis, the two largest ethnic groups that make up the majority of the population in Nepal. Let me see if I can, yes.
Do we have to worry about the interactions between ethnicity and
I'll
caste?
I'll come to that.
The caste part. Yeah.
So, in fact, when I say ethnicity here, ethnicity or ethnic identity is completely lab made. Okay, all our subjects are made salient about their ethnic identity. Moreover, it's arbitrary in the sense that before the study began, each subject is shown this slide and told, here are the 6 ethnic groups that we define. You select which one you want to belong to. So in a context, this is actually a lab-generated identity, right? Typically in a lab experiment, what happens, all the examples I gave before about in-group biases, is I bring people together and say, you are the red group, you are the blue group. And somehow being together in this instant of part of the red group makes you behave as a group better than against the blue group. Here, what we are doing is creating a similar lab identity, but the identity that tends to perfectly overlap with the ethnic identity prevalent in Nepali society. That's all we're doing. Does that answer the question?
No. So I'm confused now. People can choose.
Yeah. So if you are technically, let's say, Janjati, in this experiment, you're treated as Janjati. Okay. So it's self-determined, lab self-determined identity.
But why would a lab participant choose? Okay.
I don't know. So that's the black box. That was, I think, the root of it. How do I define identity? Whether Brahmin City identity interacts with other identity. So in this experiment, it's at that moment, you are this group.
But why did you open that up?
Precisely because of this. So it's because because I know in my data who these subjects are, which group do they belong
to? Their real.
Yeah, based on their last name, right? And they were recruited based on that, right? Because we are selective on what subjects we recruit. But I don't want to, first of all, I want to make ethnicity salient for all my subjects because I don't want that to interact with my other treatment of migrant identity, right? So it's, the only difference between the control and treatment is the intervention and not somehow the intervention interacting with this ethnic identity that's underlying here. So everyone gets the same treatment. Second, I don't necessarily understand just because your last name suggests you are a Brahmin Kshetri, right? What does that mean when you participate in the game today in the experiment? Here, what this is allowing us to do is control the environment to explicitly define a group, right? So you as a Brahmin Kshetri come with a lot of baggages, but when you are playing as a Brahmin Kshetri in this experiment today, you have no baggage. It is just in this slide, you decided to be group A. Does that make sense?
Do you observe a lot of people who are crossing over?
Probably not. Right?
Probably not. There is in between Dalits and Newars, right? Or Dalits and Brahmin Khetris, or if you are a mixed, mom and dad, different ethnic groups. But that is not necessarily the reason why we did that. It is a general practice here to sort of in the lab experiment to clean and explicitly be able to say what is the identity here triggering. And I understand this takes away from the external validity of the result. At the same time, it sort of allows us to control what exactly our salient intervention that is sort of black box is doing.
Yeah, because I see now. Because I guess like Brahmin, Kshatri, and Dalit has to do more with the caste.
Yeah.
Okay, you can be a Madesi and you can still be Brahmin, Kshatri, or Dalit.
Yeah.
You can be
and
you can still be a Dalit.
Exactly. And this is just the 6 broad category we define. I mean, if you give this task to anthropologists, they might think there are other categories that are more relevant in the day-to-day. So we didn't want our definition of what are the caste groups to sort of dictate what we find in terms of how to interpret the result cleanly. Yeah. Okay. Oh, sorry. Okay, I'm going to quickly skip through this slide, but basically the Shah dynasty that ruled Nepal for more than 300 years until recently belonged to the Brahmin Kshatriya ethnic group. So this group has sort of dominated both political and economic spheres for almost the entire modern history of Nepal. And, in fact, this ethnic disparity together with discrimination against women fueled the Maoist insurgency that ultimately ended with the abolishment of monarchy and a promulgation of a new constitution that sort of decentralized power by forming these local legislative bodies called municipalities, right? Which is a very standard decentralization process in order to improve ethnic representation and self-determination here. So if following these reforms, obviously we see in the data that there has been improvement in ethnic representation. However, even in the first municipal election held, Brahmin Kshetris were disproportionately overrepresented as municipal chairs. And together with ethnic bias in voting, this result can be explained simply by the fact that even the newly formed municipalities are still ethnically very. With the average age of only 30, quite an active members in their communities, and many of them engage in political activities after returning back as well. So if
Just quickly, the returning back, that could also be temporary, right? Like they're
yeah,
waiting for the next opportunity.
exactly.
So this is a very dynamic 7%.
Yes.
Yeah.
So this comes from the National Labor Force Survey from 2017. At that point, cross-section, they were asked whether they had migrated.
But in reality, a lot of them just.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of churning going in and out, and all of that decision is sort of interdependent and self-selected. Right? Okay. This is the data of compiling all the permits that were issued to go abroad as temporary migrant workers between 2017 and 19. You can see that majority are men, 95%. 17% of these temporary migrant workers went to Malaysia. If it's something that's interesting to this audience, Among our subjects, you see that after returning back, they have on average been back in Nepal for 3 years. That doesn't mean they will go again. Many of them have joined return migrant associations in Nepal, right? And many actively participate in activities organized by them. You see that 38% are members of the neighborhood committee that sort of makes the municipal council, like a lower tier. Many of them are members of political party. They attend budget discussion meetings organized by local governments because they need a ratification vote from the neighborhood committee to approve any local budgets under the new constitution. And, most of them voted in their life before. Yes.
Can you speak more about what are usually the reasons for people to choose to return from migration?
I can give you my view, but it's not scientific. Like I said, it's self-selected based on observable and unobservable characteristics. Typically, what I do know from data, limited data that we have from Nepal, majority of people who go abroad go for one stint. On average, it's 1.2 stints, which a stint is typically 2 years. So majority of people leaving the country only go for 2 years. There's obviously extreme end of the distribution here as well, where you spend abroad on 2-year renewals for multiple times. But on average, people go for 1 year and come back. The reason I don't know, different economists would say various things. Some would say there's no career opportunity in most of these jobs anyway. So you go do certain, menial tasks, save enough money, come back and restart with a better initial condition than 2 years prior. There are other psychological and emotional explanations as well, because you do want to come back because your families are left behind. Unlike other types of migration where you get to 10 family members with you, this visa is only tied to an employee and not to the family members of the employee.
But are there restrictions from regulations perspective, like how many times can you renew the?
There is not any restrictions on that. Only restriction is a permit typically has to be a fixed length permit. And a typical permit in our data is around 2 years, 2.1 years. It can go as long as 5 years, but that's the max. But you can renew the permit each time. But that comes with a lot of administrative costs of renewing the permit.
And there are no age limits as well.
There's no age limit. Yeah. There was certain restrictions based on gender. The rules go in and out. Sometimes there's restrictions on country of destination, depending on the situation in certain countries. But those are sort of fluid.
In this slide, you don't have this information for the non-migrant, never migrated population, right?
No. Yeah.
Because it would be interesting to know how these averages differ for the general population.
Which average? Oh, this one. Yeah, I don't have that.
Yeah,
I don't.
This survey is only migrants.
Exactly. Yeah, yes, that's true.
Yeah, I mean, this is very high level of
Engagement.
participation.
Yeah. And typically in South Asia context, at least, participation often is only explicitly expressed to voting, because voter turnouts are always very high. And this, sort of result comes from all the decentralization literature in India, where voter participation is very high. But if you go to Gram Sabha, which is their lowest level of government engagement, because by mandated, they need to have at least 4 meetings a year and all these other checks and balances, the participation in local governments is quite low. I mean, extremely low compared to voting. Whereas here, yes, voter participation is high, as with other countries, but we also see high level of engagement. And it also could be this is a very recent institution, so people are more engaged, but over time, I don't know how much active it is, and I don't know how much is self-selection, being a migrant versus a non-migrant here. Yeah. Just a quick profile of what a migration experience is like. I know this audience probably knows this. Most migrants are restricted to working in few migrant-dominated sectors here. And they actually face strict limitations on both social integration at the present time, as well as physical mobility, in addition to no strict restriction on long-term assimilation, right? In most contexts, family members do not accompany them. They often live in dormitories exclusively for migrant workers. In fact, in the case of foreign domestic workers in Singapore, any sort of relationship they have with the natives, personal relationship or like marriages, they are deported. They are not allowed to even marry locals. So there are various restrictions on social assimilation, right? In a sense that this allows these governments to sell it to the natives that this is okay, because we are sort of treating them as migrant workers. And there's a whole bunch of literature on whether that is good for the global equity or not, right? Yes. And
do you have a sense of like whether people usually were married before they embark on this temporary migration, or which one comes first?
I don't know the ratio, but they are married and non-married migrants, both male and female side. There's also a little bit of literature on marriage decision being jointly made with migration decisions. You marry and then migrate each independently. So I don't know the exact answer to that, but yes, there is a bigger concern that people, not so much in economics, but other social science tend to focus on, which is what does this type of marriage migration do to social fabric of the society, right?
I'm jumping far ahead, but on that point, last point you had on the slide, I'm curious, like, if you see more pro-social behavior, is that coming from living in dormitories with different social groups or interaction with the natives of the destination country?
So, view, the motivation for this is trying to highlight the fact that because there is not much interaction, because we do ask how many people do you work with, how many of them are migrants, and how many of them are migrants from your own country, and how many of them belong to the same ethnic group as you, right? So majority of them actually co-workers are exclusively migrant workers. In fact, most of them, on average, among our study participants, this is in the last job that they had, 18 people, they work with 18 other Nepalese at their workplace, right? And majority of them were actually from ethnic group that was different from theirs. And they lived with exclusively with Nepalese, around 4 other Nepalese. Half of them were from a different ethnic group than their own. There are other sort of stats I didn't put here. They tend to sort of loan to each other. And again, even in the lending market, they tend to loan to, 50% of them don't belong to the ethnic group that they tend to loan to, right? So as part of the priming salience, I'll show you, we ask these questions and try to build their networks of ethnic, like who are their friends, do they know from before, whether they are same ethnic group or not. I think I might not have time to get there, but yeah. Okay, so the idea is that there is substantial intermixing among migrant workers that cuts across ethnic lines. Unlike other literature that tends to come from the West, where diffusion of knowledge and pro-sociality potential comes from interacting with foreigners or like the natives in the foreign country. Here we are saying that yes, that could still be true at a limited scale, but majority of interaction involves within migrant members, but of different ethnicities, right? And this sort of social isolation from family members working in sort of a high-risk jobs can create this sense of a shared common identity that sort of cut across ethnic lines. And our idea is to understand, does that strengthen or build a common identity among these individuals when they come back? Yeah. Okay. Here are the questions, some of the questions that came up before may be answered. So in the lab experiment, what we try to do is test whether subjects, in fact, exhibit co-ethnic bias in pro-social behavior. I'll come to what that is. Whether their migration experience made salient to them through priming can change their pro-social behavior, and whether this migration effect can redress some of the co-ethnic biases prevalent in the status quo among our baseline. Right? What are pro-social behavior we are interested in? We measure 3 pro-social outcomes: altruism, cooperation, and ethnic prejudice in selecting a leader or a judge. I will describe them both in the theoretical environment and the experiment. Measured based on different economic games that we designed explicitly to measure these 3 pro-social outcomes. Right? And they were pre-registered with a PAP and all that. I'm going to skip through that because I guess you can't go more than 1 hour.
We can go 5-10 minutes.
Okay. Again, the model is quite straightforward. It's nothing innovative here except the part of how we use it. But the key part of it is, people care not just about your payoff, but the other person's payoff as well. And it's captured through this parameter alpha that's called other regarding preferences. In a Shio model, this other, how much I care about the other person depends on my perceived social distance I feel about myself and the other person. Right? And that allows there to be the social distance to be defined in any number of identities. So here's the, H can be infinite here. And it could be based on characteristics that are standard, but also could be my self-imposed characteristic. Oh, I'm a vegan. The other person or the group might not care about that identity, but I care about that identity, and it comes into my social distance perception, right? The other thing here is social distance can change if the characteristic on any dimension that I care about of the other person changes, or how much importance I currently put to that particular characteristics. And that's where sort of priming comes in. Right? Our design is quite straightforward. In one dimension, we change who you are matched with. Either you're matched with someone with your own ethnic group or not, right? So that determines whether my social distance in dimension 1 is 0 or not 0. And that difference could drive my behavior in terms of altruism or cooperation. In the other dimension, we prime half the subjects on migrant identity, and I'll come to that in a bit. And the other half is primed on not necessarily any particular identity here. And the idea is, since all our subjects are return migrants, by the way, right? There's actually on Q2, there's no social distance here. So you can think of this as sort of priming as sort of making a unifying identity more salient by increasing W2 on the dimension where the social distance is 0. And that should sort of drive the D to go down. Right? And the other reason we use priming is obviously there's self-selection on who are migrants and who are not. So this one allows us to randomize. So yeah, this sounds good. So what are these primings? So all subjects go through 2 primings. Either you're in a migrant treatment or a neutral treatment, you receive both migrant priming and neutral priming. The only difference is when do you receive those primings. First of all, a migrant priming is just a questionnaire that's asked a bunch of questions on your migration history and experience. And followed by, they are shown 4 pictures that are related to, generically related to migration, not specifically related to their migration. If you're interested, the pictures are quite standard. Here's an example. It's the pictures, 4 pictures we use for migration priming, going abroad, eating, sleeping, and passport with migrant permit. Similarly, a neutral prime includes a same sort of duration of questionnaire, but that's related to subjects' education history and school experience. Okay? So what we want to do here is ensure that both the groups have the same cognitive burden on answering these questions, both in terms of time and recall. And all the questions are structured in a very similar way with nested questions. And both of them, ethnic identity salient here. So here's a brief outline of what these priming questionnaires are like. First, there's a general question on migration history. When did you go abroad? What was the first migration? For the schooling questionnaire, we asked, where did you study? When was the first thing? Very basic question. The second part explicitly goes into 3 specific experiences. Okay, you ask about your last job. You ask second is about last housing abroad, and one last financial transaction abroad. For the schooling, it's the last course you took in school, the last field trip you took in school, and the last extracurricular activity you participated in school. So the structure is supposed to be the same. Under each experience, you ask how many participants were there, number of Nepali participants, number of participants from your ethnic group. You ask them recall name by name, whoever they can recall. But also you force them to ask who are the participants that is not from your group. Even if that is 0, they are supposed to say they are 0, right? So in that context, even if there's differences in ethnic social network diversity by ethnicity across the 2 priming, that's not driving the more pro-sociality behavior. Just because I have more migrant friends that are different from me than school friends should not drive my activity in the lab, right? So in order to make sure ethnic diversity is explicitly made aware with you, we ask specifically separately for each ethnic group to be recalled.
Sorry, just a clarification. So these questionnaires are talking about their personal experiences, their personal migration.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, here's how it's different. In the migrant treatment, you get a general survey, then you get the migration timing questions, pictures right before you play economic games. After you play the economic games, you get the schooling questionnaire. Whereas in the neutral treatment, you get the schooling questionnaire before the game and then the migrant questionnaire. Just the ordering is different, right? And here the average time spent on each of the questionnaire. On average, the migration priming took 20 minutes, but the schooling question only took 15 minutes, although they were exactly the same number of questions. But the important point is, regardless of whether the migrant priming or the schooling priming comes before or after the game, it doesn't change the average time. The schooling question just happened to be shorter in terms of how long it took. Yeah, and I'll show you that in a bit. 3 games to measure 3 outcomes. Quite straightforward. You're given 200 rupees upfront. You're asked to how much you want to give it to the other person. About the other person, you're only told about their last name and their ethnic group. So you're only told the other person you are playing with is a Brahmin Kshatriya. This is a real person, but we don't sort of put them forward because we don't want other characteristics that you can infer from any additional information, including pictures, to contaminate this experiment. So all you know is he's Brahmin Kshatriya or not, and your last name that tends to give your identity, ethnic identity in Nepal. Besides that, there's no other information revealed. Yes.
Sorry. So they have the selected identity as well as their actual identity. Is that right? So the Brahmin Chatri, that's the selected identity?
Yes, this is selected identity, but selected by the other player.
Right. But then the last name is
yes, it could be different, but in our case, it was. Yeah, you're correct. This scanner is not self-selected. This is their name. Yeah. Okay. So quite straightforward. It's a non-strategic game. Obviously, more I care about the other person, more I contribute. It's quite straightforward. Public goods game, again, the 2 players are given 200. Each independently decides how much to put in a pot. Once they decide that, then the pot is multiplied by 1.5, and then they get distributed equally. Right? And each person has to decide how much they want to put in the pot. Similar, a person they are playing with someone they hadn't played with the previous game, but same type of information is given to them. This person belongs to this ethnicity with the last name X. Right? That's it. Here, it's a strategic game, so therefore there's a Nash equilibrium here, and the equilibrium is increasing in alpha, basically. That's again, a very standard result, so I don't want to go into detail. The third one is different. Here, we play the public goods game, but with a punishment. Here, what happens is all subjects play with someone always from a different ethnic group, regardless of your initial treatment assignment on ethnicity. But they're told that if you contribute too little to the pot, you might be punished, okay, and will take money back from you. They're not told how much is too little, but they're told that someone else, a third person, will decide independently for both the players how much is too little, independent, right? And they're allowed to choose between the 2 arbiters. They're given a choice. Either you can choose who that person can be, and the choice they're given is, okay, I'm playing with this person, but there are 2 arbiters. One belongs to a Brahmin Kshatriya, one belongs to a Janjati, right? Always 2 different ethnic groups. So one is always the in-group arbiter for the subject, but that in-group arbiter is actually the out-group arbiter for the other player, right? And vice versa. Right? And they are supposed to choose who they want to pick as their leader or arbiter.
And they know this before they know the identity of who they are playing against?
No, they know this simultaneously. They're told. They always play with someone from a different ethnic group in this one.
But then you reveal the identity of you reveal the ethnic group of the person they are playing with.
Yes.
The arbiter, the choosing of the arbiter comes after?
After.
Yeah. So they know, so for example.
I'm always playing with someone from a different ethnic group.
Yeah.
If I pick this, let's say this is my in group, right. For the other player who I already know who that is now, right. Is the out group. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Here, we sort of try to extend the social preference model that sort of doesn't go into selecting a leader to see whether it can be extended to also predict ethnic biases in quote-unquote voting or picking a leader. And we actually get a quite nice result here. And we take a very general CS utility function, right? So you can see here that there is a line here that divides the 2 regions where for any value of R, right? So you can go from 2 payoffs being completely substitutes to complete complementarity. Think about any utility function from linear to Cobb-Douglas to near which the R covers the whole range. You see that if you are in this region, you strictly prefer in-group arbiter, okay? And for higher level of alpha or higher level R, depending on where you are indifferent between your in-group arbiter and out-group arbiter, okay? But what this suggests is as alpha increases, your likelihood of picking an out-group arbiter also goes up because you're likely to be in this region as alpha goes up for a particular R. Does that make sense? Yeah. The only assumption here is that the difference between the two arbiters in this model is the subject's perceived threshold level for him as well as what the perceived level could be for the partner, right? As long as they believe that the in-group arbiter is slightly lenient towards the subject rather than, and the outgroup arbiter is the other way around, the regions are always the same. This is the prediction here. Does that make sense? It doesn't depend on any other parameter except this assumption that the in-group arbiter would always be lenient.
But won't, like, doesn't this rely on, expecting the in-group arbiter to have similar preferences for public goods provision, right? Like, because the arbiter would determine what the low threshold of public good provision is.
Yes.
But would the arbiter actually have a choice to sort of like observe what the choices of the player is, and then choose to favor that person?
Yeah. So basically, the arbiter who also made this real economic decision sees, okay, I know subject A who belongs to this ethnicity is playing, how much is too little for this guy, right? So it's economic, and it's a cost to them to punish someone as well. So it's not a free punishment mechanism here. The only thing is, if this assumption flips, right? In fact, the subjects believe the outgroup arbiter is going to be more lenient, then the region is exactly the same. The line that divides the region is also the same. Only thing is the gray area becomes the strict preference for outgroup arbiter, and the white area becomes indifference. Right? That's it. But on average, in our experiment, subjects do believe that the in-group arbiter is going to be more lenient. And that also is incentivized to correctly guess the threshold level. Yeah. Okay, I really need to speed up.
15 minutes.
Yes. So at the end, the results are quite straightforward. Again, the study was conducted in 2022, all returned migrants. We have a pre-analysis plan. We had a power calculation based on like a small sample that we did before. I'm going to skip all through that. Only maybe what would be interesting is there was a salient priming treatment that requires someone to look at pictures and discuss with the lab assistant. We recorded it, and we randomly selected 50% of the recording, transcribed it, translated it, and then feed through a very standard unsupervised structural topic model that sort of picks out what are the topics that come up. And what we do find is, first of all, the 3 topics that come up are the topics that they were primed on. Either it's something related to migration, something related to school, or the pictures that they looked at, which happen to be nature in the neutral priming. Not only that, the people in the neutral treatment tend to talk more about the topic that they were just being asked about. And people in the migrant treatment tend to talk more about migration topic, which makes sense, but it sort of suggests that priming, at least the quality of the priming, there were certain standards, because right before they played the game, they were sort of talking and thinking about the topics that they were primed on. The other thing is, there was a difference in the timing of how long it took to prime, to conduct a schooling survey versus a migration survey, as well as if you look at whether the time it took to conduct economic gains priming varies by whether you are matched with a different identity or whether you got the migrant treatment, does not change. So it's, in terms of quality checks, we're quite confident that there's no differences across the 4 treatment arms on the quality of how both priming and economic gains were implemented. Here's the result of the dictator game. In the neutral treatments, we do find in-group bias in how much they can give to the other person, roughly around 20% less to an outgroup than an in-group. In the migrant treatment, we find basically no difference in the contribution based on ethnicity. And this difference, not statistically significant, is quite small, almost 0% difference. And this difference is also different from the original cohorting bias, as you can see from that estimate. Okay. Public goods gain, neutral treatment, cohorting bias, roughly around 30% here. Okay. In the migrant treatment, there is no difference between in-group and out-group. Close to zero, around 3% difference. But that difference is not different from zero, neither is and it's statistically different from the original co-ethnic bias in the neutral treatment. Again, quite straightforward. One thing I do like to point out that these are games that had meaning, because these are quite, like, 200 rupees is roughly around $1.5. That is quite a lot. That's roughly around 30% of the daily wage in Nepal for each game. We also see that their contribution is highly correlated to their beliefs about what the other person should do, which makes sense. Like, in theory, your belief about the other person should dictate how much you want to contribute, and we see that it's highly correlated. So it means that these people are rationally making those decisions. Okay. Arbiter choice in the neutral treatment, people tend to prefer in-group arbiter. We're quite surprised that this number wasn't higher. It's around 58% tend to pick an in-group arbiter. In the migrant treatment, it goes down to 47%, and this difference is statistically significant. And for all these three main outcomes, we adjust for multiple hypothesis testing and all that. There were additional games that I didn't perhaps talk about. We do see that the difference in contribution between whether there was a punishment or not. So basically what we find is the black one is the game, how much I contributed for these 4 groups when there was no penalty. Second one is when there is an exogenous penalty. There is no arbiter. Basically, they were told if you put too little, you'll be punished. And just by introducing penalty across all 4 treatments, their contribution within the subject went up, right? Which is, again, a standard prediction both in theory as well as in previous lab experiments as well. And you can see that in outgroup neutral, when I match with an outgroup person without any migrancy treatment, the punishment mechanism itself improved contribution by 90%. Right? In the neutral treatment, in the punishment case, we find no co-ethnic bias as a result. In the outgroup treatment, there is no difference between migrant and neutral treatment. So basically, punishment sort of takes care of this migrancy effect because you're reducing co-ethnic bias through punishment. These are all lab experiments. One thing we would like to do is sort of see whether our lab results sort of translates into real world evidence. Here's an attempt to that. We've tried to examine the effect of migration co-ethnic bias in voting in the election in 2017. So as mandated by the Constitution, after the new Constitution, there were 753 municipalities and 6,743 wards, which are sort of local legislative bodies that were formed. Each municipality assembly is headed by a municipal chair who is democratically elected by a popular vote. The municipal assembly consists of ward chairs that are also elected by a popular vote within the ward, right? So elections were held between May and September 2017. So we want to see whether there is co-ethnic bias by migration returns. So obviously this provides several challenges. First of all, voting patterns by ethnicity is not readily available. It is not in Nepal, but as well in most other countries. Second, voter rolls are returnees, including candidates, whether they are returnees or not. And the third is the obvious endogenous issue here that we need to overcome. So I'll show you a couple of slides and we can end. We try to address all of these 3 concerns to varying degrees, and you decide whether it's enough or not. First, we compile data on all votes received by each candidate for these positions. Right? Second, we look at their last name and code which ethnicity do they belong to. Okay, for each candidate. For the voter information, we use the 2011 census to estimate a voting age population as of 2017 by ethnicity in each municipality and ward. The dependent variable that we construct is basically a square difference between the share of votes received by candidates from a given ethnic group minus the share of that ethnicity's share of the voting age population in the municipality or ward. summed across all ethnicity, right? Fairly standard sum of square difference variable. 0 here sort of indicates that each ethnic share is perfectly aligned with the vote receiving share of the candidate's ethnicity. As the value increases, there's less vote alignment by ethnicity. Okay. For the main independent variable, we calculate the migration rate for each municipality or ward to GCC of Malaysia based on the 2021 Nepal census. Okay. With the assumption that areas with higher migration rate to these destinations are also likely to have greater share of returnees living among their voter population. An instrumental variable strategy we employ is a regional variation in historical migration networks to instrument for this current migration rate. Particularly, we look at migration rate to GCC and Malaysia in 2001 census, 2 decades prior. Okay. And obviously, although the use of historical migration as an instrument is common in economics, but it does provide a lot of concerns in terms of whether the exclusion restriction is satisfied or not. First concern is if the returnees from past migration constitute a large share of the current voting population, that absolutely violates the exclusion restriction. Second, there could be time invariant characteristic that drove historical migration that also affects current migration decision as well as voting decisions, right? So it doesn't address that. But a unique context of Nepal, I think, helps us sort of overcome some of these. First of all, temporary migration is actually quite a recent phenomenon in Nepal. So prior to 2001, right, there were literally only 17,000 permits per year distributed annually compared to 355,000 after that. And this figure sort of shows you the exponential rise in temporary labor migration based on permit data, right, across these periods. So our historical migration IV is sort of capturing these few migrants that are going to these countries whose prominence wasn't that big. And after that, you see an exponential increase in migration to these countries. Second, in the 2001 census, related to this point, economic migrants to GCC and Malaysia made up a very small portion. These countries were not the most prominent destination countries in 2001. And what this allows us to do is 2 things. Low level of temporary migration prior to 2000 suggests that returnees from the historical migration data do not constitute a significant proportion of the current voting age population today. Second, the dominance of few destinations allows us to utilize destination-specific historical networks as an instrument, right? Destinations that weren't big prior but are big now, and independently control for overall migration in top of that. Right? So you're using few destination-specific historical migration as the IV, while also controlling for overall migration rate from each of these municipalities separately. Right? And here's the result. The OLS and the IVs are quite similar. First of all, the first stage is also very strong. And they all sort of together suggest, both for the municipal as well as the ward share, that higher temporary migration rate in 2001 from a municipality or a ward, instrumented in IV case by historical migration network to these countries, decreases co-ethnic bias in voting in 2017. And it's robust to controlling for ethnic diversity among voters, as well as the candidate diversity and candidate selection, as well as various public goods available at that time in those municipalities. Okay, just to summarize, in status quo, we do observe co-ethnic bias in both altruistic and cooperative behavior, roughly between 20 to 30% co-ethnic bias. Migrant crime completely eliminates in-group bias in both strategic and non-strategic environment. Subjects are also more willing to choose a leader that do not belong to their ethnic group. And this lab result in particular is also in line with our finding from the real world data, where higher rates of temporary migration areas exhibit less co-ethnic bias in voting. Comparing these results to the theoretical model, it sort of suggests that the social distance between subjects in the out-migration treatment becomes similar to the in-group, right, basically. and meaning that the migrant crime successfully reduces social distance between different ethnicities here. And leads to the evidence that migration experience can be this unifying common identity that reduces ethnic tensions. Punishment increases cooperation between different ethnic groups. Punishment mechanism in public goods can increase cooperation to the extent that the in-group bias by ethnicity is completely masked. Right? In fact, migrant priming effect is slightly weaker than the punishment effect. Punishment effect was around increasing contribution by roughly like 89%, whereas the migrant crime reduced co-ethnic bias by roughly around 30%, right? But the key point we want to take is when effective punishment mechanisms are absent, right, which tends to be the case in many of these contexts, a unifying identity like a migrant identity can play an important role, right, to foster group cohesion and collective action. Well, the last sort of interesting point that we don't have necessarily much to say beyond this point is the type of punishment also matters. What is interesting here is exogenous punishment versus an arbiter giving a punishment. People tend to respond more to a person giving a punishment than an exogenous punishment. Although in reality, if you think about it, both are exogenous because it's predetermined. Like for a subject, it doesn't matter whether, even the arbiter is not in the real time sort of punishing you. It's predetermined based on what your threshold is and what your contribution is. But despite that, just because I think that someone else is judging me somehow makes me more pro-social. Right? Just an interesting point I want to end with. Right. Any questions?
Questions? Maybe quickly, free to stay, ask questions, or
I was wondering if
go
it's
online
on
quickly.
Yeah.
Any questions online? We have Bolaji and Ijatina. Okay. Maybe we can end and we can continue with questions.
Yeah, please feel free. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.